Welcome, welcome. This is our Fortified wine and Aromatized wine 101. It is a 101, it is a primer. There is a wealth of knowledge you can be gained on all of the different styles we're about to talk about today. We are just going to give you just the smallest sip of each one, and I hope our descriptions of port, sherry, Madeira, vermouth, Americano, all of these lead you to be interested in trying and learning about, by trying, all these different things. Vino do Porto, port wine, or just port, is a fortified wine from Portugal. Now, similar wines are made all over the world, whether it's Argentina, Australia, the US, Canada, France, South Africa. But according to EU denomination of origin protection laws, you can only call it port wine if it's from Portugal. Port wine is made out of wines. It's a fortified wine that is made out of base wines that are produced in the Douro Valley. Now, there are over 100 varieties of grapes you can use in the production of port, but most of them come down to the 5 most popular, the best or most common one being Touriga Nacional. How is port wine made and why is it different from regular table wine, also made in the same valley? Well, a couple of things are different, but mainly what you normally think of as port wine, the most common styles of port wine are sweet red wines, like that guy. Port comes in a number of styles. There's ruby, there's tawny, there's vintage, there's white, and there's a lot of sub-styles among all of those. Now, ruby's the most common, and it is a sweet wine often served with dessert. Once again, it's not the only style. But how is it made and why is it sweet? Well, what happens is, as they're making the wine, they arrest fermentation by adding spirit. Meaning, if during fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, the yeast is eating the sugar and making alcohol, but yeast can only tolerate alcohol to a certain point. So how they make this wine sweet naturally is they let the wine partially vinify, and then they dump in neutral grape spirit, or aguardiente. Sometimes it's called brandy, but it wouldn't be a brandy like you'd expect to see in the market. It's a neutral grape spirit is the best way to think about it. And they'll take this spirit and put it in the vat and jack up the alcohol past where the yeast can survive. What that does is A, kills off the yeasts, arrests any more further fermentation, but leaves the sugar that the yeast didn't eat as sugar. So it is a naturally sweet red wine in this ruby style, and they'll let the wine vinify a little drier for drier styles. At the bar, we'll reach for ruby, tawny, and white ports for various cocktails. Vintage would be an expensive waste of money because, as the name implies, vintage port is very old, and as something gets older, it's more costly. And it's just not the best use of it in a cocktail. But ruby, there are plenty of great examples of. White port is really lovely in spritzes and refreshing drinks, and tawny has interesting flavors that go really well with whiskeys. In the south of Spain, wine has been made since the Phoenicians introduced the grapes to the region in 1100 BCE. So they've been making wine in that area for a very, very long time. Christopher Columbus sailed with sherry. Magellan spent more on sherry for his trip than he did on weapons. So it's been around a long time. And for you Shakespeare fans, Falstaff, when he's drinking sack, he means sherry. Sherry, a fortified wine from the south of Spain, notably the town of Jerez de la Frontera is where it gets its name. So sherry, also called Jerez or Jerez, depending on what language you're speaking it in, they're all featured prominently on the back of the bottle. So sherry is made in a number of styles. Most commonly, sherry is made from a grape called Palomino. Now, the lighter kind of table white wine styles of Fino or Manzanilla, there are richer, darker styles that often are allowed to oxidize. So they're all fortified the same way, say, port is fortified, but the richer, darker styles are also allowed to oxidize, meaning that the wine is allowed to touch or contact air in large quantity. So the richer styles, Amontillado, and Oloroso are also allowed to oxidize. There are some dessert styles made from some different grapes, mostly Muscatel and Pedro Jimenez, and sometimes those grapes are backed into the richer, darker styles just to give them some more body. Now, these styles are really nice to use in cocktails. The lighter stuff really works well when you're thinking you want to plug and play something that would come with a vermouth. The richer styles also can be really nice for heavier, sweeter vermouths, and or they're often used to substitute for spirit in low ABV cocktail variations. Madeira. It gets its name from the island from which it comes, which is Madeira. It's a Portuguese island just off the coast of Africa. Now, on the island, they grow 4 major grapes for the making of their wines. There's Malvasia, Boal, Verdelho, which is just how the Portuguese say Verdejo, and Cercial. This is rainwater, which is made in a number of different kinds of grapes depending on which one, and it's a lighter style. So there's heavier, richer styles, and there are lighter styles. That what they all share in common is a rich, raisinated flavor profile. Now, what separates, besides the geography, these wines from, say, port and sherry is that port is fortified, and sherry, in the richer styles, is allowed to oxidize. This is fortified. It is allowed to oxidize, but it is also madderized, which is a word that takes its name from Madeira, but it really just means they cook it. They basically raise it in temperature to, I believe, around 145 degrees and keep it there for months on end to mimic the conditions in the hulls of ships that they had when they were exporting it and we were importing it in the New World. And what happened to the wine is that kind of almost toasty, caramelly notes that were allowed to develop were something that were sought after from therefore, but also made the wine kind of bulletproof. Once you oxidize and maderize a wine, it's really kind of hard to mess it up after that. So we really like this wine to use in cocktails because of those raisinated notes and those hints of toffee, caramel kind of notes really favor a lot of fruit flavors and also go really, really well with a large variety of spirits. Aromatized fortified wine. It's a big category. We have a few examples here. The most famous examples of aromatized fortified wine are vermouth. Now, aromatized fortified wine is, as the name suggests, wine that has been fortified and then aromatized, simply meaning that botanicals and flavorings were added to either the base spirit that we're fortifying with or the wine itself in order to give flavor. And a lot of these botanicals come from the pharmacological background of spirits, basically. So Antoni Benedetto Carpano was the first person to name his product vermouth after the German word vermouth. So he came up with the style that became known as Vermouth de Torino because it was from the Duchy of Turin. So he had what came to be called sweet red Italian style vermouth. Once that became incredibly popular throughout Europe, people started doing their own riffs on it. Joseph Noilly in the south of France came up with dry vermouth. So also a wine fortified and then also and imbued with different botanicals that were more present in the area of the Mediterranean France. So it's a dry wine instead of a sweet wine. It presents white instead of red. And then finally, of the big 3 vermouths, we have Blanc vermouth, which was invented in Chambéry, which is now in France. And it's a clear white vermouth, but it is sweeter than sweet red Italian vermouth. So our 3 main styles of vermouth would be sweet red Italian. I should also let you know at this point that the red is not from the grapes. These are white grapes, but there are caramel, meaning burnt sugar, added for coloring, and it's part of the classification of this style of vermouth, especially in Turin. If you want to make Vermouth de Torino, doesn't matter what producer you are, there's a number of different ones. Legally, you have to use burnt sugar to color your wine. That's part of the style of making wine in this area. So you have sweet red Italian vermouth. you have dry French vermouth, and then you have blanc vermouth. That being said, all of the styles of vermouth are made in all of the places that make them, right? In France, they make red, sweet vermouth, they make blanc vermouth, and in Italy, they make dry vermouth, but the nicknames have held in some circles that the red kind you just call Italian. So if you're looking at an old cocktail book and it says Italian vermouth, they mean this style. If it says French vermouth, they mean this style, regardless of where you get it from. So those are the three vermouths. Now, vermouth gets its name from the German word vermouth, which is the word for wormwood. Wormwood being a bitter herb, or it's the herb used to bitter this. So when I was talking about coming from a history of pharmacology, bitter herbs were often used to open the appetite and to help digestion. All over Europe for history. It's the same reason that bitter herbs are used in the making of gin. Bitter herbs are used in the making of a lot of things, but they're used in this case for digestion. But wormwood's not the only one. So the category of aromatized fortified wine became popular, and it often became, the vermouth specifically became popular all across Europe, and then all across the world. This is a Spanish vermouth, these are American vermouths, Japanese vermouths. So all over the world we're making vermouths now, but also that same idea of using a bitter bottom end note in fortified wine for digestion and as an aperitivo became popular in many different styles. Americano is a very popular style, and that came when they started mixing aperitivo, like Campari, that style of liqueur, with sweet red Italian vermouth, and they would bottle them together and call it an Americano, or in the American style, after the fact that Americans like to mix things. So there's a traditional kind of Americano aperitif. This is an Americano Bianco, or a white Americano. This is Bonal Gentian Quina. Now, that means it's bittered with both gentian, another bitter herb, and when it says quina on the bottle, that means quinine. The same thing that makes tonic bitter, that same, the same salt from the bark of the cinchona tree is used in here. This is also a Grand Quina. Notice that name quina comes up again, and that means quinine. So whether you're bittering with bitter herbs like vermouth, or gentian, or you're bittering with quinine, almost all of these things purport to have these benefits of opening the appetite before the meal or helping you digest after the meal. And although these, just like the ports and sherries and Madeiras that we showed earlier, were all intended originally to be consumed by themselves, here we make them in cocktails. We use them as ingredients in cocktails. So there's clearly an entire alphabet, a history of vermouth-based cocktails, but also these are becoming more and more popular and have been popular. And as the category of vermouth and the styles of vermouth stratify out and give us more and more options, we'll continue to find new and new ways to use delicious ingredients like these in the rest of our cocktails.